I'm Jerry, and for most of my life, I thought I had it all figured out. I'd been married to Betsy for 30 years. 30 years. Can you imagine? We met in college, married young, and built a life together. I had a steady career as a project manager at a tech company. Our daughter, Amy, was the light of our lives, all grown up and thriving in her own little world. I wasn't just content, I was proud. Life was solid. Or so I thought. Then it happened, a moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, but it changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just come home from running errands. Betsy was in the living room with her group of friends. These were women she'd known for decades, the type who shared wine on Fridays and went on yoga retreats together. Normally, I'd just nod and head to my workshop, but this time, I lingered by the doorway. At first, it was nothing. Just the usual laughter and chatter. But then I heard Betsy. Really heard her. She was talking about me, about us. Not in the sweet way you'd expect from someone you've shared a lifetime with, but with this mocking edge. I swear, Jerry wouldn't notice if I painted the walls neon green, she said, laughing. The others chimed in, piling on about how oblivious men could be. Then came the gut punch. Sometimes, I wonder if he even has a backbone. He's just so predictable. Predictable? Backbone? I stood there, frozen. Betsy wasn't defending me. She was laughing along, encouraging it. It felt like she'd taken all the years of love, loyalty, and effort and turned them into a joke. That night, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. The house felt colder somehow, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. It wasn't the words themselves, it was her silence, her choice to join in instead of standing up for me. A crack had formed in what I thought was an unshakable foundation. And once you see a crack, you can't unsee it. Suddenly, all the little things Betsy and I had brushed under the rug over the years began to resurface. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started watching, listening. And what I found made me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage after that night. I started paying attention to things I hadn't before, things I'd probably ignored or brushed off. Betsy and I weren't fighting or anything like that, but something felt off. Once I noticed that first crack, it was like the dam holding everything together was starting to weaken. The first thing I noticed was how little we actually talked anymore. Sure, we went through the motions. How was your day? What's for dinner? But there wasn't any depth to it. I couldn't remember the last time we sat down and had a real conversation, one of those long talks where you lose track of time. When did that stop? She spent more and more time on her phone, especially when she thought I wasn't looking. Not just scrolling or playing games, but texting. She'd smile at her screen, then quickly lock it if I walked into the room. Work stuff, she'd say if I asked. But Betsy worked part-time at a non-profit. How many work emergencies could they really have? One evening, I decided to test the waters. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, the TV playing some crime drama she liked. I glanced over and said, "You've been busy with your phone a lot lately. Who's keeping you so entertained?" She looked up, startled, then forced a laugh. "Oh, it's just Sharon. She's planning some big anniversary party and keeps sending me ideas." She turned her phone over on the coffee table and leaned back, smiling at me like that was the end of it. Maybe it was Sharon, but something about her reaction didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the defensiveness, it was the way she dismissed it, like I wasn't supposed to question her at all. And for the first time, I started wondering, what if there's more to this? A few days later, I overheard her on the phone with someone. She was in the kitchen, talking in that low, hushed tone people use when they don't want to be overheard. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, I just happened to walk past at the wrong moment. Or maybe the right one. "I'll see what I can do, but he's been around a lot more lately," she said, laughing softly. There was a pause, then, no, he doesn't suspect anything. That stopped me dead in my tracks. Who was she talking about? And what didn't I suspect? I stood there, feeling my stomach twist into knots. Before I could move or say anything, she hung up. A second later, she walked out of the kitchen, saw me, and froze for a split second. Then her face lit up in that too-perfect smile. "Oh hey," she said, breezing past me toward the living room. "Just talking to Sharon again. She's a handful." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing. I had to know more. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling again. I knew I was at a crossroads. I could let this go, keep pretending everything was fine, or I could dig deeper. Find out the truth. I didn't like where my thoughts were headed, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my gut. So I made a decision: I'd start keeping track. If there was something going on, I'd find it. And if there wasn't, well, then maybe I was just paranoid. Either way, I had to know the next morning. I felt like I was operating on autopilot. Betsy seemed her usual self, humming to the radio as she packed up for a volunteer event. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, just like she always did, and I tried not to flinch. My mind was still stuck on that phone call. He doesn't suspect anything. It played on a loop in my head, taunting me. Once she was gone, I went straight to her phone. I know how that sounds, but I was desperate. She wasn't the type to leave it lying around unlocked, so all I could do was stare at the black screen. It was password protected, of course, and I didn't dare try guessing. If she got any notification that I'd been messing with it, she'd know something was up. Plan B, then. I spent the day researching apps and tools, ways to recover deleted messages, track activity, anything that could give me a peek behind the curtain. I felt ridiculous, like some kind of amateur detective, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do this. My instincts were screaming at me. I settled on installing a simple program on our shared computer that would let me monitor her accounts if she logged in. It felt dirty, invasive even, but I kept telling myself that if there was nothing to find, then no harm done. Right? That evening, Betsy came home in high spirits, chatting about her day. I played along, nodding and smiling in the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. I'd already set everything up and was just waiting for her to use the computer. As luck would have it, she did. After dinner, she logged in to check something, probably her email, I figured. I made some excuse about needing to fix a shelf in the garage and left her alone. My heart was pounding the whole time. When she finally went to bed, I stayed up late, pretending to work, but really, I was checking the program. It didn't take long to find something strange. Betsy had an email account I didn't recognize. It wasn't anything obvious, just a string of random letters and numbers. But the kicker was the sent folder. Among the emails were several to someone named M. The messages were short, almost cryptic, but they made my blood run cold. Can't wait for Thursday. Usual spot. Jerry's busy Saturday. Let's talk then. Thursday? Saturday? Who was M? And why was she hiding these emails? I stayed up all night reading and rereading every word, trying to piece it together. By the time the sun rose, I felt like I was in free fall. Part of me still wanted to believe it was innocent. Maybe M was a friend, a colleague. But I couldn't ignore how secretive she was being. The next step was clear. I needed proof. Something undeniable. But how far was I willing to go? I wrestled with that question all day, but when Thursday came around, I knew what I had to do. I followed her. Thursday felt like it stretched forever. Betsy left the house around noon, dressed nicer than usual. Nothing too flashy, but enough to make me notice. Heels instead of her usual flats, a spritz of perfume she hadn't worn in a while. "I'm meeting Sharon for lunch," she said casually, grabbing her purse. "Don't wait up, we might do some shopping after." I just nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. "Have fun," I said, and watched her walk out the door. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to wait. I didn't want to seem too obvious if she was watching from the driveway or down the block. After about 10 minutes, I grabbed my keys and followed. She drove to a little cafe on the other side of town, one we'd been to a few times but never frequented. I parked across the street and waited, half expecting to see Sharon walk in behind her. But Sharon never came. Instead, about 15 minutes later, a man showed up. Tall, well-dressed, maybe in his early 40s. He walked in, glanced around, then headed straight for Betsy's table. She smiled as he approached, a smile I hadn't seen in years. Not polite, not friendly, but warm and intimate. He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek before sitting across from her. My stomach dropped. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the car. They didn't touch much, but their body language spoke volumes. She leaned forward when she talked, her hand resting on the table like she wanted him to reach for it. He laughed at something she said, and she smiled back, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. They looked comfortable, familiar. Like this wasn't their first meeting. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, torn between storming in and demanding answers or sitting tight and gathering more proof. My head was a swirling mess of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could she do this to me? To us? After about an hour, they left the cafe together. I followed them as they walked to a nearby park. They strolled along the path, talking and laughing, until they stopped by a bench under a tree. And then it happened. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just smiled. That was all I needed to see. I took a picture with my phone, proof. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was. Betsy was having an affair. I drove home in a daze, unsure of what to do next. Confront her? Tell Amy? Hire a lawyer? My thoughts were racing, my chest tight with emotion. When she came home later that evening, acting like nothing had happened, I could barely look at her. Shopping went well? I asked, keeping my voice even. Oh yeah, she said breezily, hanging her purse by the door. Sharon found some great deals. It was a nice day. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. She didn't even flinch as she lied to my face. That hurt almost as much as seeing her with him. I knew this wasn't over. I needed to know more, how long this had been going on, how deep it went. But more than anything, I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do about it. The next few days were a blur of emotions, rage, sadness, disbelief. But one thing kept me moving forward. I needed more answers. Betsy went about her usual routine like nothing had happened, and I played along, waiting for my moment. Late one night, when she was asleep, I crept into the living room and opened her purse. My hands were shaking as I rummaged through it, hoping to find something, anything that could give me more clarity. At first, there was nothing unusual, lipstick, receipts, gum, but then I found her second phone. My heart sank. It was a cheap burner phone, the kind you buy at a drugstore. The screen lit up when I pressed the button, and there it was, a series of texts between Betsy and M. M, I had a great time today. I can't stop thinking about you. Betsy, me too. Can't wait for Saturday. M, same spot. Betsy, of course. Usual time. I felt sick reading those words. There was no mistaking what this was. She hadn't just crossed a line, she'd obliterated it. My hands tightened around the phone, and for a split second, I wanted to wake her up and confront her right then and there. But I stopped myself. I needed more. The next day, I called in sick to work. Betsy left in the morning for her volunteer shift, and as soon as she was gone, I got to work. I went through our shared bank accounts, looking for any unusual charges. Sure enough, there were several payments to a hotel across town, dates that matched the timestamps on the texts I'd read. I also found cash withdrawals that didn't make sense. Betsy wasn't the type to carry a lot of cash, but over the past few months, she'd been taking out a few $100s here and there. It wasn't enough to raise red flags on its own, but now, it was another puzzle piece falling into place. Then there was the car. She usually parked in the driveway, but lately, she'd been using the garage more often. I went in and checked her car for anything suspicious. Under the passenger seat, I found a crumpled receipt from a restaurant we'd never been to. It was dated weeks ago and showed a meal for two. It was like everything I'd ignored or dismissed over the past few months was suddenly glaringly obvious. The late nights, the work texts, the extra effort in her appearance, it all pointed to one thing. She'd been seeing this guy, M, for a while. And I'd been blind to it. That evening, I sat at the dining table, staring at all the evidence I'd gathered, the texts, the receipts, the hotel charges. I felt hollow, like I was watching my life fall apart from a distance. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself anymore, but I wasn't ready to confront Betsy. Not yet. Instead, I called Amy. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey Dad." "What's up?" she said, her voice cheerful. I hesitated, not wanting to drop this on her, but I needed someone to talk to. "Amy, I need to ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Has your mom been acting differently lately?" There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. I explained as vaguely as I could, how Betsy had been distant, how I'd noticed some unusual behavior. I didn't mention the affair outright. I just wanted to see if Amy had noticed anything. "Well, now that you mention it," she said slowly. "She has been a little weird the past few times I've talked to her. Like she's distracted or something. Why? What's going on? I couldn't bring myself to tell her the whole truth, not over the phone. I'm not sure yet, I said. But if you notice anything, let me know, okay? Of course, Amy said, her tone serious now. Are you okay, Dad? I wasn't, but I didn't want her to worry. I'll be fine, I said. Thanks, sweetheart. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the evidence. I wasn't sure what my next move was, but one thing was certain, I couldn't ignore this any longer. The next couple of days were tense. I'd gathered enough proof to know what was going on, but I still hadn't figured out how to confront Betsy. Every time I looked at her, pretending everything was fine, it felt like I was suffocating. Saturday came, and my opportunity presented itself. She left around noon, dressed casually but wearing the same perfume she'd used before her lunch with Sharon. Heading out to run errands, she said, grabbing her purse. Don't wait up for dinner, I might grab something while I'm out. This time, I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I already knew where she was going. Instead, I spent the afternoon preparing myself for what was coming. When she came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room. The burner phone, the receipts, the texts, I had it all laid out on the coffee table. She walked in, humming softly, and froze when she saw me sitting there. Her eyes darted to the table, then back to me. What's all this? She asked, her voice tight. You tell me, I said, keeping my voice steady. She took a hesitant step forward, her face pale. Jerry, I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the act, Betsy, I interrupted, my voice rising. I know about the hotel, the texts, I know you've been lying to me. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. I can explain. Explain what? I snapped. Explain how you've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, laughing with your friends about how clueless I am. That last part seemed to catch her off guard. What? No, Jerry, that's not. Don't, I said, holding up a hand. I heard you, Betsy. That day with your friends. Predictable. Spineless. Was that a joke too? She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her face twisting in frustration. Okay, she said finally, sinking into the armchair across from me. Okay, yes. I've been seeing someone. But it's not what you think. Not what I think. I repeated, incredulous. So you're not having an affair? You're not sneaking off to meet him at hotels? It's not like that, she insisted, though her voice wavered. It started as, I don't know, a friendship. Someone to talk to. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Far enough that you're lying, sneaking around, and meeting him behind my back? I said, my voice rising again. How long, Betsy? How long has this been going on? She hesitated, and that hesitation felt like a knife to the chest. A few months, she admitted quietly. I sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why would you do this to me? To us? She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. I don't know, she whispered. I was lonely, Jerry. You're always so busy, so wrapped up in your routine. I felt invisible. And then, he noticed me. Her words stung, but they also made me angry. You felt invisible? Betsy, I've been here the whole time. 30 years of marriage, and you couldn't just talk to me. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You managed to do that anyway. For a long time, we sat there in silence. Finally, I stood up. I need some time to think, I said. Don't expect me to just forgive this, Betsy. I don't know if I can. I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there, crying quietly. I didn't feel relief or satisfaction, just an overwhelming sense of loss. The life I thought we had was gone, and I had no idea what was going to take its place. The hours after our confrontation felt surreal, like I was drifting through a fog. I ended up in the garage, of all places, sitting on the old workbench I used to spend hours at when Amy was little. Back then, I'd tinker with projects while she sat on the floor, playing with her dolls or asking endless questions about what I was doing. Those were simpler times. Times when I didn't feel like the ground beneath me could just crumble away. Betsy didn't come to find me. I think she knew better. When I finally came back inside, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the living room lamp. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, still in her day clothes, her face streaked with dried tears. Part of me wanted to wake her up and demand more answers, but I was too emotionally drained. Instead, I went to bed alone. The next morning, Betsy was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Her hair was messy, and she was staring down into her mug like it held the answer to everything. "Morning," I muttered, grabbing a glass of water. She looked up, her eyes red. "Jerry, we need to talk." I didn't respond right away. I wanted to avoid this conversation as long as possible, but I also knew it wasn't going away. With a deep breath, I sat down across from her. "Go ahead," I said. She fidgeted with her mug, tracing the rim with her finger. "I never wanted to hurt you," she started, her voice shaky. "I know that sounds hollow now, but it's the truth. I didn't wake up one day and decide to throw everything away." I stayed quiet, letting her continue. "I guess it started because I felt stuck," she admitted. "Like we were just going through the motions. The same conversations, the same routines. And then I met Mark." "Mark," I repeated, my stomach twisting at finally hearing his name. She nodded, her gaze still fixed on her coffee. "He made me feel seen. Like I mattered. I know that sounds terrible, but it's the truth. And it wasn't physical at first. It was just talking, meeting for coffee, things like that. And then I pressed." She hesitated, then sighed. "And then it turned into more. I didn't mean for it to, but it did. And I hate myself for it, Jerry. I really do." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange kind of pity. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me for the first time, her eyes wide with surprise. "No," she said quickly. "No, it's not like that. I care about him, but I love you, Jerry. I always have." Her words felt like a slap in the face. How could she say she loved me while doing this? I shook my head, trying to process everything. "Do you understand what you've done?" I said, my voice trembling. "You've destroyed 30 years of trust, of memories, of everything we built together. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't feel any sympathy this time. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. But I want to try. Please, Jerry, give me a chance to make this right." I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. "I need time," I said. "I can't just sweep this under the rug and pretend everything's okay. I need to figure out what I want, what's best for me." Without waiting for her response, I walked out of the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there, ended up driving aimlessly for hours, the hum of the car engine the only thing keeping me grounded. I replayed everything Betsy had said over and over. "I love you, Jerry." How could she say that while betraying me so completely? The weight of it all sat heavy on my chest, like I couldn't breathe properly. Eventually, I found myself parked outside Amy's house. I hadn't planned to go there, but it was like my subconscious knew I needed her. She was the only person I felt I could trust. Amy opened the door with a smile that faded the second she saw my face. "Dad? What's wrong?" I tried to keep my composure, but the moment I stepped inside, the dam broke. The words poured out of me messy and raw, how I'd caught Betsy lying, how I'd followed her, the texts, and the confrontation. Amy listened, her face a mix of shock and anger, until I finally finished. "I don't know what to do, Amy," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't know if I can forgive her." She sat beside me on the couch, putting a hand on my arm. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I can't believe Mom would do this. I mean, I knew something was off, but I didn't think it was this bad." I looked at her, startled. "What do you mean, you knew something was off?" Amy hesitated, biting her lip. "She's been distant lately. When we talked, it felt like she was distracted. I didn't want to pry, but now I'm wishing I had." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Had everyone but me seen this coming? "What should I do, Amy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do I even begin to move forward from this?" She sighed, her expression thoughtful. "Honestly, Dad, that's up to you. You have to decide if you want to try to work things out or if it's time to let go. But whatever you choose, you can't rush it. Take the time you need to figure out what's right for you." Her words were comforting, but they didn't make the decision any easier. Part of me wanted to try, to see if we could rebuild what we had. But another part of me, the part that was still raw and bleeding, couldn't imagine ever trusting Betsy again. Amy hugged me tightly before I left, telling me to call her any time I needed to talk. I drove home feeling a little less alone, but the question still swirled in my mind. Could I forgive Betsy? Should I even try? When I got back to the house, it was quiet. Betsy was in bed, or at least pretending to be. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty coffee table where all the evidence of her betrayal had been. I thought about the life we'd built, the years we'd spent together, the good and the bad. And for the first time, I let myself wonder, was it all worth saving? The week after our confrontation felt like I was living in someone else's life. Betsy and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was polite, surface-level stuff. Did you eat? Do you need anything from the store? Like we were roommates, not a married couple of 30 years. She was trying, though. I could see it in the way she left my favorite snacks on the counter or how she lingered near me, waiting for a chance to talk. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't look at her without hearing those texts in my head or picturing her with Mark. I spent most of my time out of the house, walking through the park, sitting in the truck in the grocery store parking lot, even just aimlessly driving around. Being home felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in on me. Amy checked in a couple of times. She didn't push, just listened when I needed to vent. "Take your time, Dad," she kept saying. "Don't rush into anything." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the hurt under it. This wasn't easy for her either. On Friday, I came home late after sitting in the parking lot of a diner for hours, staring at my untouched coffee. Betsy was still up, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her. She looked up when I walked in, her face pale and tired. "Jerry," she said softly, standing up. "Can we talk? Please." I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. "Not tonight," I muttered, heading toward the bedroom. Her voice cracked behind me. "I can't keep living like this. Please, just tell me if you're leaving so I can—" I turned around sharply, my exhaustion boiling over. "I don't know, Betsy. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to feel. I don't know anything right now." She flinched like I'd slapped her, tears pooling in her eyes. For a second, I almost softened, but the anger in me wouldn't let go. I walked to the bedroom and shut the door behind me. That night, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The trust was gone, and so was the marriage I thought I had. What was left? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I couldn't avoid it much longer. The morning after my outburst, I woke up feeling drained. I'd been tossing and turning all night, replaying Betsy's words in my head. "Just tell me if you're leaving." The way her voice broke haunted me, but I couldn't push past the anger to feel sorry for her. When I walked into the kitchen, Betsy was already there, her face pale and drawn. She handed me a cup of coffee without a word, then sat at the table. I could feel her watching me, waiting. "Do you even know what you've done to me?" I asked suddenly, my voice harsher than I intended. She flinched but didn't look away. "I do, Jerry," she said quietly. "I think about it every second of the day. I hate myself for it." I stared into my coffee, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Do you? Because it sure didn't seem like it when you were sneaking around with him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't try to defend herself. "You're right," she said softly. "I was selfish. I let myself believe that what I was doing didn't matter, that it wasn't hurting anyone. But it did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I saw a flicker of the Betsy I used to know, the one who cared about how her actions affected others. But it wasn't enough to erase what she'd done. "I'm not sure I can do this," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm not sure I can forgive you." "I don't expect you to," she said, her voice steady now. "But I'm asking you to let me try to make this right. For us, for everything we've built." I didn't respond. I just got up and walked out the back door, needing air. "How are you holding up, Dad?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I don't know," I admitted. "Some days, I want to walk away and never look back. Other days, I think maybe we can fix this. But I don't know where to start." She paused, then said, "Have you thought about therapy? Maybe talking to someone could help you figure things out." I scoffed at the idea at first. Therapy wasn't something I'd ever considered. It felt like admitting weakness. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed help. I couldn't sort through this mess on my own. That evening, I told Betsy I was willing to try therapy. Her eyes lit up with a mix of hope and relief, but I quickly added, I'm not making any promises. This isn't about saving the marriage, it's about figuring out if I can even stand to look at you again. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'll take whatever I can get, she said. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A week later, Betsy and I sat in the waiting room of a therapist's office. The silence between us was heavy, like neither of us dared to speak. She glanced at me a few times, as if trying to gauge my mood, but I kept my eyes on the carpet. When the therapist, a calm-looking woman named Dr. Franklin, called us in, I felt my stomach twist. I didn't know what to expect, and part of me was terrified of hearing things I wasn't ready for. We sat across from Dr. Franklin in her cozy office, the smell of lavender faint in the air. She smiled warmly, her tone gentle but professional. I'm glad you both decided to come in today. This is a brave first step. I wasn't sure about brave, but I nodded anyway. Dr. Franklin started by asking us why we were there. I let Betsy go first. I've made a terrible mistake, she said, her voice trembling. I hurt Jerry in a way I can't take back. But I love him, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Her words sounded rehearsed, but the emotion behind them felt real. Dr. Franklin turned to me. And you, Jerry? How are you feeling about all of this? I took a deep breath, struggling to put my thoughts into words. Angry, I said finally. Hurt. Betrayed. I keep thinking about all the years we spent building this life together, and now, I don't know what any of it means anymore. Dr. Franklin nodded, her expression empathetic. Those feelings are completely valid. Betrayal can shake the foundation of even the strongest relationships. What do you hope to get out of these sessions? I hesitated, then said, I need to figure out if there's anything left to save. And if there isn't, I need to figure out how to move on. The rest of the session was a blur of raw emotions. Betsy admitted to feeling neglected, like we'd fallen into a routine where she felt invisible. I fired back, asking why she didn't just talk to me instead of turning to someone else. It wasn't about him, she said at one point, tears streaming down her face. It was about me, about feeling like I mattered to someone. Her words stung, but they also gave me a small sliver of insight into her mindset. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me realize how far apart we'd grown without even noticing. By the time the session ended, I felt like I'd run a marathon. Dr. Franklin encouraged us to keep an open mind and reminded us that healing, whether together or apart, would take time. On the drive home, Betsy finally broke the silence. Thank you for coming, she said softly. I know this isn't easy for you. It's not, I replied, staring straight ahead. But it's a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely lost. After that first therapy session, things between Betsy and me became complicated. We weren't fighting, but we weren't exactly rebuilding either. It felt like we were both tiptoeing around each other, afraid to make the wrong move. The following sessions were a roller coaster. Dr. Franklin asked us to dig into the roots of our problems, and that's when the cracks in our marriage really came into focus. Jerry, Dr. Franklin said during one session, can you tell me about a time when you felt distant from Betsy? When you felt something shift in your relationship? I hesitated, the memories coming back slowly. I guess it started after Amy left for college, I admitted. We'd spent so many years focused on her, and when she was gone, it was like there was nothing left to hold us together. We stopped talking about anything real. Betsy nodded, wiping at her eyes. I felt it too. But instead of talking to you about it, I buried myself in other things. Volunteering, my friends, anything to distract me from how lonely I felt. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't realized how much we'd both been avoiding the truth. Dr. Franklin leaned forward, her voice calm and steady. Betsy, why do you think you didn't bring these feelings to Jerry? What stopped you? Betsy took a shaky breath. I was scared, she said. Scared that he'd brush me off, or worse, that he'd agree we didn't have anything left. Mark, he was just there. He listened. He made me feel important. I know that doesn't justify what I did, but it's the truth. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. And you didn't think I'd listen? After everything we've been through? She shook her head. I don't know, Jerry. I was selfish. I didn't think. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on both of us. Dr. Franklin broke the silence. It's clear there's a lot of pain here, but there's also a desire to understand each other. That's a good place to start. The question now is, what do you both want moving forward? I didn't have an answer for that yet, and I told her as much. I need time, I said, to figure out if I can forgive her, if I can trust her again. Betsy nodded, her face filled with guilt and sorrow. I'll give you as much time as you need, she said softly. But even as she said it, I couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at an old photo album. It was full of pictures from when Amy was little, family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. Betsy and I looked so happy in those photos, so connected. When had we lost that? And more importantly, could we ever find it again? The days following our last therapy session were quieter than usual. Betsy gave me space, but her presence was heavy in the house. Every time I passed her in the kitchen or saw her sitting in the living room, I could feel the weight of her regret pressing down on both of us. She tried to show me she was serious about making things right. She deleted the burner phone and handed me her regular phone, saying, "I don't want there to be any secrets between us." She canceled her volunteer commitments and stopped going out unless it was with me or Amy. Part of me appreciated the effort, but another part, the wounded, angry part, felt like it was too little, too late. I was still in the middle of that internal battle when Amy called one evening. "Hey Dad. How are things?" she asked. I sighed, sinking into the recliner in the den. "Complicated," I admitted. "Therapy's been helpful, I guess, but I'm still not sure what to do." Amy hesitated before responding. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you and Mom. About how I grew up watching you two. You weren't perfect, but you were always there for each other. That kind of stability. It meant everything to me." Her words stirred something in me, a memory from years ago. It was Amy's first middle school play. She had a small part, but Betsy and I had made a big deal of it. We sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone when she came on stage. Amy had told us afterward that seeing us there gave her the confidence to push through her nerves. "We were good, weren't we?" I said softly. "You were," Amy replied. "And maybe you can be again. But only if you both really want it." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. That weekend, Betsy and I had another therapy session. Dr. Franklin asked us to focus on what we wanted for the future, not just individually, but as a couple. "What do you want your life to look like a year from now?" she asked, looking between us. Betsy spoke first. "I want to rebuild what we've lost," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to be the kind of wife Jerry deserves, the kind of partner he can trust. I know I've broken so much, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it." Her words were sincere, but I couldn't ignore the anger bubbling under the surface. "It's not just about fixing it, Betsy," I said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. How do I know you won't feel lonely in 5 years and find someone else to make you feel important?" Betsy's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't have an easy answer for that, Jerry. I wish I did. All I can say is that I'm willing to prove to you every day that I've changed." Dr. Franklin intervened gently. "Jerry, trust is a process. It's not something that can be guaranteed up front, but it can be rebuilt over time. The question is, are you willing to try?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the floor, wrestling with my emotions. Part of me wanted to walk away and never look back, but another part, the part that remembered all the good years, all the memories, wanted to give her a chance. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "But I'm willing to try. For now." Betsy looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "That's all I'm asking for," she said softly that night. Betsy suggested we go for a walk. It was something we used to do all the time when Amy was little, but we'd fallen out of the habit over the years. The air was crisp as we strolled through the neighborhood, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. For a while, we didn't say anything, just walked side by side. Finally, Betsy broke the silence. "Do you remember the first time we walked this path?" she asked. I nodded. "It was when we first moved here. Amy was still in diapers, and she screamed the whole way in the stroller." Betsy laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. "And you made up that ridiculous song to calm her down. It worked, didn't it?" I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension between us eased. It didn't erase the pain or the betrayal, but it was a start. When we got back home, Betsy hesitated at the front door. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. It felt normal. Like us. I didn't respond, but I nodded. Inside, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The weeks that followed were an uneasy mix of progress and hesitation. Therapy was helping, but rebuilding trust wasn't a straight line. Some days, Betsy and I could talk like we used to, laugh about old memories or sit quietly without the air feeling heavy. Other days, the weight of what had happened would crash down on me, and I'd pull away, retreating into myself. One evening, we were in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. Betsy had made my favorite meal, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed, even if I didn't say anything. As we stood side by side at the sink, she spoke softly, almost as if testing the waters. "Jerry, I was thinking, maybe we could go away for a weekend. Just the two of us. A fresh start, even if it's just for a few days." I froze, my hands still wet from rinsing a plate. The idea sounded good in theory, but the thought of spending an entire weekend together felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said finally, avoiding her gaze. She nodded quickly, her face falling. "Of course. I understand. I thought it might help." The disappointment in her voice tugged at something inside me. I wanted to believe in her efforts, to believe she was genuinely trying. But every time I started to let my guard down, the memory of her with Mark would creep in, making me question everything. That night, as I sat in the den flipping aimlessly through channels, Amy called. "How's it going, Dad?" she asked, her voice warm and steady. I sighed, running a hand over my face. "It's complicated. She's trying, but I don't know if it's enough." Amy paused. "You know, I've been thinking about something. If Mom's putting in the effort, maybe you should meet her halfway. Not for her, but for you. You deserve to know if this can work or not, and the only way to find out is to really give it a chance." Her words sat with me long after we hung up the next morning. I found Betsy in the living room, a cup of coffee in her hands and an anxious look on her face. "About the weekend," I said, my voice hesitant. "Maybe we should give it a shot. A change of scenery might be good." Her face lit up with a mix of surprise and hope. "Really? Are you sure?" I nodded. "Yeah. But let's keep it simple. Nothing fancy." She smiled, and for the first time in a while, it didn't feel forced. We ended up booking a small cabin about an hour away, tucked in the woods by a quiet lake. When we arrived, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling trees and the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The first day was quiet. We unpacked, made small talk, and took a short walk by the lake. It wasn't until dinner that things started to shift. Sitting across from each other at the small wooden table, Betsy reached for my hand. "Jerry, I know I've said this before, but I need you to hear it again. I'm so sorry for what I've done. I hate myself for hurting you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worthy of your forgiveness." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes, but she held my gaze. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," I said honestly. "But I can see you're trying. And I think that's why I'm still here." It wasn't much, but it was the truth. After dinner, we sat by the fire pit outside, the flames casting a warm glow in the chilly night. For the first time in months, the silence between us didn't feel so heavy. As we watched the fire crackle, Betsy spoke softly. "Do you think we can ever get back to the way we were?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I don't know," I said finally. "But maybe it's not about going back. Maybe it's about figuring out how to move forward." Her hand brushed against mine, and this time, I didn't pull away. The weekend at the cabin was a turning point, though not in the way I expected. It didn't erase the pain or make everything magically better. But it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. On the drive home, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Betsy stared out the window, her face calm but pensive. I kept my focus on the road, replaying the conversations we'd had over the past 2 days. The questions, the apologies, the memories, it all swirled in my head, but for the first time, it didn't feel so overwhelming. When we pulled into the driveway, Betsy turned to me. "Thank you for coming with me," she said softly. "I know it wasn't easy for you." I nodded. "It wasn't. But I think it helped." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held a cautious hope that night, I sat in the den with a glass of whiskey, staring at the flickering TV without really watching it. I thought about the life Betsy and I had built, the good years, the hard years, and the years we'd let slip by without really seeing each other. I thought about Amy, about the stability she'd always credited us with giving her. And I thought about Betsy's affair, the lies, and the broken trust that now sat between us like a wall we couldn't ignore. Finally, I went to find her. She was in the bedroom, folding laundry, her face drawn and tired. She looked up when I walked in, a question in her eyes. "Betsy," I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I've made a decision." She froze, her hands gripping the shirt she was holding. "Okay," she whispered. I took a deep breath. "I'm not ready to forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. But I'm willing to try to move forward, to see if we can rebuild something together. It's not going to be easy, and I can't promise anything. But if you're willing to put in the work, then so am I." Her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance. I won't waste it, Jerry. I promise." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. The weeks that followed were slow and painstaking. We started small, talking more, sharing meals, and taking walks together like we used to. Therapy became a regular part of our routine, both individually and as a couple. There were setbacks. Some days, the anger and hurt would resurface, and I'd question if I'd made the right decision. But then there were moments of connection, small fragile glimpses of the life we'd once had, and those moments kept me going. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Betsy reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll ever get there?" she asked quietly. I looked at her, at the woman I'd spent 3 decades of my life with, and saw the genuine remorse in her eyes. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think we're moving in the right direction." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no guarantees, no promises of happily ever after. But for the first time in months, I felt like we had a chance, a small fragile chance, to build something new out of the wreckage. And for now, that was enough.